welcome to a new episode of Melt. I'm Ritvika Gupta shooting from home. Over the last 16 months, we have seen COVID-19 change the landscape of the FMCG industry. Kantar's latest Consumer Connections report examines how consumers have responded to the changes and how brands have made use of the situation. Here are some key highlights. Immunity was a strong performer in the last year. High-value categories like hand sanitizers or surface cleaners were introduced into the consumer purchase basket. Villages closer to urban towns or cities grew at nearly 5% in volume and were driving rural's overall volume growth. Baby-specific products are being purchased more and more. To know more, Anant Rangaswami, editor of Melt, is in conversation today with K Ramakrishnan, Managing Director, South Asia Worldpanel Division at Kantar. Let's get ready to melt with K Ramakrishnan.
Morning, Lamki, and good to see you again.
Hi, Anand. Lovely to talk to you again.
So, you've been doing study after study during the pandemic, which is good for all the marketers. And the latest study is fantastic, I think, for the FMCG marketers. There's lots to chew on.
Sure. Thank you.
And the area I want to talk about the most is what is happening in rural India.
Right.
I mean, yours is a large study and there are lots of things we could discuss. But I thought we can do a deep dive into one aspect of it,
Right.
which is of great consequence.
Right.
Especially if it looks like overall we're getting a good monsoon. If it rides on the tailwinds of an improved market anyway, it's fantastic.
Right.
So tell me your view in a short sentence on the rural versus urban landscape. If you say, does rural look better, look the same, whatever it may be?
So to me, rural looks better fundamentally because the fundamentals are right in the sense monsoon, harvest, support pricing, and non-farm income. These are four factors which typically drive the robustness of the rural economy. All the four are in a good place. So from that point of view, both 2020 and 2021 have been good for rural. Urban is a little less volatile than rural, I would say, because rural, 1 year of a bad monsoon and things tend to go down, etc. But urban is a little more stable. To that extent, its ability to go up further also is limited, whereas rural has its ability to overtake. And that's what is happening right now. And this is also on top of two bad years for rural, 2018 and let's say even the begin towards mid or late mid of 2019 also were bad years for rural because they were down. And from there, they're coming up. I think rural is far more robust to be affected by the pandemic this year. The reason is, if you take all the numbers in totality of the total cases in rural and take it as a percentage of the number of rural households, it still seems limited. So from that point of view, rural has not got that affected. Second, mobility has not got that affected in rural as much as it has got affected in urban. In urban, we were stuck to our homes. In rural, there was fairly decent amount of mobility available. So mobility, fundamentals being good, numbers being large, all these factors point to a good rural going ahead of urban.
So Ramki, I was looking at all the data and looking for outlier data, unusual, I would say. Outlier is your word, unusual is my word. So and I found this hand wash versus sanitizer was quite a lesson. What other kind of outliers have you been able to find?
So as you rightly said, Anand, it is an outlier in the sense that one would typically look at life cycle of products or categories. Hand wash would first make its entrench itself to some extent, and then sanitizer would come, etc. But that path has been sort of disturbed by the pandemic, I would say. So the difference that we're seeing is in urban, hand wash is much better penetrated than sanitizers, despite the fact that sanitizers have got a 200-300% jump over the previous year, etc. But it's the reverse in as far as rural is concerned, which means sanitizers are penetrated higher than the hand wash. Now, why is this reversal? There are two possible explanations for this. One is that I think rural was behind in the life cycle of hand wash as a category itself. So hand wash had not penetrated as much as it had in urban India. So to that extent, it was behind, number one. Number two, in the pandemic, while both categories got a push, the slightly higher push was for sanitizers because it was widely being spoken about and stuff like that. Third, marketeer action, sanitizers being available in the small sachet packs, etc., which was easily usable by rural. Fourth is a possible lack of running water across all location in rural, which is a requirement for hand wash. If that is not there, a sanitizer is a much easier thing to use. So I think these are the four causes which possibly help us explain this outlier of sanitizers penetration being ahead of hand wash in rural India.
Okay, I'm going to ask you two questions which are not data-led, it's more subjective. So the sort of spurt in sanitizer, is that a short-term sort of provocation by the pandemic, or do you think it could be a habit change, the beginning of a habit change?
I'm beginning to believe that it's a habit change. The reason is, yes, you're absolutely right in saying that it's super sensitive to the intensity of the pandemic, which means very high intensity, sanitizer booms, intensity drops, sanitizer drops. But does it drop and fade off is the question that we need to ask ourselves. Because always we need to look at a situation of a pre-pandemic. The pre-pandemic situation, 0.2% penetration, to post-pandemic situation, 16 plus penetration percentage, right? So when in the high intensity times, it goes up to 20%, 22%, then drops back to 19% kind of thing. But even now it is 19%. So to that extent, to me, when there is a wave of purchases, there'll be a whole lot of people who will join in. And there will be a few who will drop off when the wave subsides. That's okay, but it still is a sizable number. So to that extent, it is a habit entrenchment that is happening to sanitizers, is my view.
Okay, the second subjective question I asked, you had Lifebuoy, Dettol, and off late Savlon, all spending a lot of money. Lifebuoy perhaps for more than 10 years, Dettol for more than 10 years in what looked like a kind of weak investment, spending money in rural India, trying to get people to wash their hands and so on and so forth. Right. Do you think that it's a kind of slow burn that has happened, that people had the message in their heads and now they are provoked to consume?
Absolutely. I mean, always the message was there. I think it reached enough. They used all kinds of means to reach those locations. I think the first push came with Swachh Bharat itself, which means the facilities for cleaning, the facilities, the toilets, and the campaign around toilets and things like that. And definitely brands like Dettol, and in fact, even brands like Harpic and Domex and others, they kind of rode on the wave of Swachh Bharat to some extent. But definitely the pandemic came and gave it one surge or an acceleration, which kind of took it up to a different level now, is what I would say. It's a provocation which helped in the acceleration of those categories.
Right. Now, while we are talking about categories and brands, in the last sentence, you spouted 3-4 brands, and then we spoke about categories. So one of the interesting bits of your study is build on what we discussed the last time, which is trusted brands gain. And that's a kind of continuing pattern you're finding.
Absolutely.
Plus, shrinking of the consideration set, where, shall we say, the less recalled brands don't exist in this game. So expand on these two, please.
This happens exactly whenever there is an uncertainty in the consumer's mind. When do we see an uncertainty? When there is an external stimulus which is slightly threatening. And the threat could be in the form of a pandemic, the threat could be in the form of a recession, the threat could be in the form of something like a lack of liquidity, something like a demonetization, or any of those. Whenever there is an uncertainty like this, the consumer's mind tends to gravitate towards familiarity. And where does familiarity come from? Familiarity comes from known brands that have been with always, or the ones which are most distributed, most widely used, etc. Which is the reason the pandemic is an uncertainty. The pandemic is a situation of, what shall I say, disequilibrium, unequilibrium. And in that situation, consumers definitely tend to gravitate towards what they are familiar with, which is the bigger brands, which is what is clearly happening. So therefore, what does that mean? And exactly as a result of this, the experimentation drops, which means if I'm going to things that I'm familiar with, if I'm continuing to do things that I've always seen people do, then what I'm doing less of is experimenting to do some new actions, which is trying new brands, etc. So experimentation drop and gain of the big brands are both kind of go with hand in hand. So this is a factor which happens in uncertain times. And as this, I think over time, the consumer is getting used to this start-stop phenomenon, right? Wave 1, longer time, then they start again. Then there's a wave 2. Wave 2 is shorter than the wave 1, but more intense. Then they start again. So as this start-stop phenomenon starts to continue and people get more used to it, I think they will come back to experimentation. It's not that the mind is switched off experimentation. It will come back. There is a drop in that at the moment is the point that we make.
Right. Every time historically that we've had a slowdown in the economy, we have a debate in the media whether brands should spend more or spend less. Now, I look at your data now and think, for God's sake, spend more. Am I right in that interpretation? Expand on that.
You're absolutely right. See, because every time there is an uncertainty is when trust is required. So for trust, you need to keep continuing to spend. If you're a big brand, yes, you have the benefit of higher penetration. You have the benefit of people coming to you in terms of uncertainty. But to keep that, you have to keep continuing to spend from the point of view that once the uncertainty goes off, some experimentation will start. The experimentation is going to come at your cost. So if you're not right on top of mind, you have a higher tendency to lose. That's from the big brand's point of view. From the smaller brands perspective, yes, you're threatened in times of uncertainty because people go towards big brands. But if you don't spend now, by the time people start experimenting, you will not be in their minds at all. And to start afresh at that point of time would require substantially more investment. So from either of these point of view, I would always say in a bad time, invest.
Right. Now I'll go out of syllabus.
Okay.
So right now, should brands be spending on performance or brand? Because there's another debate continuously. And leaning is towards performance in many companies because they say they can measure ROI or they're at the bottom of the funnel and so on and so forth. But if I look at your study, I say again, for God's sake, spend on brand. Performance will come later, but spend on the brand. So what's your take on this?
I am a brand person, probably old school of thought in that people and brand marketers should spend on brand for the longer term. Performance, yes, absolutely. It's not that it's devoid of performance. It's not going to be brand at the cost of performance. But if I were to take a punt between the two, I would say brand.
Okay, so the other interesting bit, which is obviously logical, is proximity of rural to a large urban center, and the closer it is, the higher the tendency to embrace sanitizer, hand wash, and so on and so forth that you saw. So is there headroom for other categories to learn in proximity, invest more in the large rural area next to a large urban area, for example?
Absolutely. So the reason why that concept of proximity we brought in is because we, as marketers, and I've been guilty of that as well, we tend to kind of brush rural as one broad stroke. This is all rural. And irrespective whether it is close to a big city, whether it is far from a big city, whatever the size of that rural center is, etc. Despite that, we say this is all rural. This will happen in rural. So this is a rural phenomenon kind of thing. And rural is such a mix of things, and there is such a motley mix of things where the behaviors are so different. One parameter that you can consider is the proximity from the urban. So the closer the rural center is to an urban center, it tends to mimic urban a little more. So from that point of view, is there a way in which distribution can be driven to take advantage of that? Is the point that we're making. Currently, we are seeing that in sanitizers and things like that, but it's true for all categories. The closer the village is to an urban, it tends to mimic urban more. And this is actually contrary in some of the rural. Again, there's so much to learn in India, right? I mean, if you look at the urbanized states, let's say some of the southern states, etc., versus not so urbanized states like let's say UP, Bihar, Rajasthan kind of states, etc., you will see that the difference is more stark in non-urbanized states than urbanized states. What I mean is, in a state which is highly urbanized, whether it's near or far, the behavior tends to be much similar. Whereas if you look at Madhya Pradesh, UP, Bihar, Jharkhand areas, you're able to see marked differences in behavior in villages closer to urban centers in relation to villages farther from urban centers. So therefore, the point that we are making is always keep looking for parameters that can differentiate rather than painting them with one single brush stroke. So we tend to commonize and therefore find a common solution in what we call as the least common. So that tends to not give us the right answers or the right intended move that we want the consumers to make. It is important to identify whatever variable. This is just one variable, distance. There could be so many other variables, like extent of education prevalence in rural can be another variable that you would look at. Women working could be another variable that you could look at. Or funding given by government for development could be another variable. So there's so many variables that you can look at and use them as a means to sharply differentiate, and as a result, market better is all we would submit.
Right. So is it a case for my taking your research and overlaying it on IRS or something like that? Is that a case?
It's always going to be a triangulation. I mean, if you look at any marketing organization, they take data from multiple sources. They take data from household, they take data from shops, they take their own internal data, and they take a lot of data from qualitative as well. And then they do all the syndicated available, and it's going to be a triangulation of that. I think it's the dependence on one is never going to be the case. You need to look at multiplicity of data and then see what is the best that suits the phenomenon that you are trying to do at the moment. So that's where I would say it is going to be a combination of data.
On the same thread, is there a case that, right now, all the studies that we see from all research companies like you, say urban and rural, is there a case to add something in between on a permanent basis? All of you talk to each other and decide, okay, let's add this semi-urban or semi-rural. Is there a case? Because obviously, the way a marketer will view them or invest in these, shall we say, more proximate to urban markets should be different.
Right. So to be honest, there is already such a division available. Particularly if I take urban, we actually divide it by town classes, saying the metros, 5 to 10 million, and each one's behavior is different, and data is also cut by these.
But you have that in urban. You don't have that in rural.
We do, in the sense that by village sizes, in the sense that what is the population, the same population strata that we do in urban is also available in rural. Is it used widely is a different question. But is that available? Definitely, the data can be cut by village sizes. Data can be cut by proximity. Data can be cut by several such factors. It is available. The point is, it is easier to brush it with a broad stroke. So that's where I think things take a little bit of a backseat. But the data is available.
Right. This reminds me. Many years ago, maybe 12 years ago, I went to Baroda to the TAM setup. When LV was running TAM. And then I, keep in touch with BARC, and I find there's so much data they have, which nobody uses.
Sure. Yeah.
And for you and for them, there's a way to measure whether your data is getting used or not. So is there an opportunity for us to speak soon in the future about the 25 things we can do with your data, but nobody does?
I'm sure. I mean, I would frame it as 25 things you can do better with our data. Yeah.
Right. So off the top of your hat, can you tell me 3-4 things I can do which marketers don't seem to realize it's there?
Yeah. So if I look at the panel itself, the household panel, I think what are we doing? We are calling it longitudinal. It means we go to the same person again and again and again, rather than randomizing and finding different people. So this is a brilliant way to actually study the evolution, right? Whereas evolution is seldom seen well enough. I mean, we always tend to see data for 6 months, data for compared to the same period last year, and that's where it stops. Whereas if you look at it as a 15-year cycle and say, is there something that I can pick up from this, the way this has moved? Then there is so much more. There are clients who do it. It's not that nobody does it, but that's a much useful data. If you have a longer history of data, and those data points will give you much more lessons than always comparing it to the same period last year and the last 6 months and what's going to happen in the next 3 months. That seems to be one pressure that marketeers are under. Of course, they are under pressure because of quarterly performance and whatever it is, but there is data for a longer period of time which can be used certainly better.
Okay, that's one. That's one you've given me. What else can you think of?
Second one is what you rightly said, which is the fragmented nature, not fragmented, I would say the granular nature of data that is available, which is if you can break it down to smaller zones. Like, for example, we actually can provide data up to pin code clusters. Not even like if you take, we can take a large city like Mumbai and break it into multiple pin code clusters. What I mean by that is intuitively you will know that the South Bombay is going to behave very differently from some of the suburbs. I mean, that's a very intuitive thing to say. But within South Bombay itself, there are pin code clusters. There are clusters which behave differently within them, and so there is so much to learn from them. So that granularity is something that can be better used. Is another top of the mind thing that comes to.
Right. One would think it was obvious. No, I would use the granularity to make my distribution more efficient, so that I don't have to move stock and so on and so forth. Yeah. For example, your part of the study on the babies.
Yes.
So obviously, something like a diaper will sell far better in Tony Malba Hill than they might in a Mira Road. So can I get to that level of granularity with your data?
Like at the moment, not up to pin codes, but clusters of pin codes definitely possible. But the differences that you're talking about, Anant, are the obvious differences, which means you are saying that some of these areas will use more diapers than the others, which will be very true. But the point is, there's a fair degree of uniformity or homogeneity in behavior when it comes to babies' products, right? Households in suburbs also buy a whole lot of diapers. But is there a difference between the two by way of pack sizes? Is there a difference between the two in terms of the unit price that they're willing to pay or brands? Those are the things that make a difference. I mean, some of the soft drink companies have used this data quite well to see which are the areas that they can drive to using the 5 rupee bottle or the smaller bottle as opposed to the larger 1 liter bottles in some other areas. And the difference will not be stark enough if you look at it as does this area consume more or less? You get more granular by pack size, you get more granular by location, etc. Then it kind of throws more light.
Right. So, the last 1 year, certainly, you and I have spoken fairly often. And, my question to you is, are you having far more conversations with marketers today than you had in a pre-pandemic world?
Certainly. Not just marketers. I'm saying we're having far more conversations with the top management than we would ever have. I think the absence of the physical requirement of office, etc., is kind of helping meetings much easier. So to that extent, what happens is if there is a bunch of insights that we want to share to the marketing team along with the marketing insights team, the insights team makes it known to everyone that, look, there is this session. If you can, join. Otherwise, you dip in. And more often than not, we find that top management dipping in, even if it's for shorter duration. So to that extent, definitely they are available and spending time to look at what they may not have otherwise found time in the physical world.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Ramki. As always, a pleasure talking to you. And
Absolutely.
Now, by force of habit, look forward to another conversation in 3-4 months.
Very soon. Thank you so much.
And that was K Ramakrishnan sharing how rural markets in India are outshining urban. He is now presenting the MEL cheat sheet. When there is uncertainty, consumers tend to gravitate towards bigger, well-known brands. The closer a village is to a city, its behavior will tend to mimic the latter. It's important to identify all variables before marketing to rural areas. And that's a wrap on this episode of Melt. You can follow us on social media. Our handle is Ready to Melt. And stay updated with all that's happening in the world of advertising and marketing with our daily Melt update on our website, readytomelt.com. I shall see you next week, same time, same place. Goodbye.